20 years of relentless ambition had transformed David Chen from a junior executive to CEO of America's largest auto parts empire. But what he overheard, while disguised as a maintenance worker, would shatter everything he thought he knew about. His success. Two employees' whispered conversation was about to unravel not just his company's future, but the truth about his own father's mysterious disappearance. The sprawling precision auto parts manufacturing facility in Detroit cast long shadows across the snow-covered parking lot as dawn broke on a bitter February morning. Steam rose from the facility's massive ventilation systems, creating a hazy, industrial aurora against the purple-orange sky. The factory's modern exterior gleamed with recently installed solar panels and smart glass windows, a testament to the company's commitment to innovation, or at least its public image of it. Inside, the air hummed with the rhythmic percussion of machinery. Conveyor belts snaked through the 200,000-square-foot facility like mechanical rivers, carrying partially assembled components through various stages of production. The polished concrete floors reflected the LED lighting above, creating an almost clinical atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the industrial nature of the work being performed. David Chen, CEO of Precision Auto Parts, adjusted the unfamiliar weight of the navy blue maintenance uniform he now wore. At 45, he'd spent the last decade in tailored suits, but today he was Michael Wong, a new maintenance worker starting his first shift. The fake mustache itched against his upper lip, and the colored contacts felt foreign in his eyes, but these discomforts were necessary for his mission. Recent employee satisfaction surveys had shown a troubling decline in morale, and the board was concerned about increasing turnover rates. The factory floor sprawled before him like a miniature city, each section dedicated to a specific component of their automotive parts production. The air carried the distinct scent of metal and machine oil, mixed with the coffee aromas wafting from the break rooms scattered throughout the facility. Workers moved with practiced efficiency between stations, their movements choreographed by years of routine and the unrelenting pace of production quotas. Near the quality control section, a group of workers huddled around a malfunctioning sensor. Ray, his first assignment as a maintenance trainee. Sarah Martinez, the maintenance supervisor who would be training him today, stood waiting with a tablet in hand, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, safety glasses perched on top of her head. "Welcome to the trenches, Michael," she said, her voice carrying the slight roughness of someone who'd spent 20 years shouting over machinery. "Hope you're ready to get your hands dirty. These sensors have been acting up all week, and we're falling behind on our quality checks." David nodded, trying to adopt the slightly nervous demeanor of a new employee. He'd reviewed the maintenance protocols countless times in preparation for this undercover assignment. But actually standing here, surrounded by the machinery he usually only saw in quarterly reports, felt surreal. The last time he'd worked with his hands had been during his engineering internship fresh out of college, before his rapid rise through management had distanced him from the factory floor. The facility's morning shift was hitting its stride. Now, the overhead speakers occasionally crackled with announcements, mixing with the steady rhythm of pneumatic presses and the whir of robotic arms. David followed Sarah toward the malfunctioning sensor array, observing how workers acknowledged her with genuine respect as they passed, something different from the careful deference he usually encountered as CEO. They were halfway to their destination when David heard it, a conversation between two employees behind him that made him stop cold in his tracks. The words seemed to cut through the industrial symphony like a knife, forcing him to confront a truth he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. "You know who designed this original sensor system?" one voice said, laden with the weight of long-held knowledge. "It was old man Chen, the current CEO's father, the one they forced out during the corporate takeover in '03. The one who supposedly embezzled company funds." The second voice replied, heavy with skepticism. My dad worked here back then. He always said something didn't add up about that story. David's hands began to tremble slightly as memories flooded back. Memories of his father's face, the day the board had presented their evidence, of the newspaper headlines that followed, of the last conversation they'd had before his father disappeared from his life entirely. He'd been a junior executive then, newly promoted, watching helplessly as his father's reputation was systematically destroyed. "Hey, Michael, you okay?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. "You look like you've seen a ghost." If only. She knew how accurate that description was. David forced himself to move forward, but his mind was racing. He'd spent years believing the official story about his father's guilt, climbing the corporate ladder at the very company that had destroyed his family's name. But now, standing here in a maintenance uniform, he was about to discover that everything he thought he knew about his past, his father, and his own success might be built on a foundation of lies. What he would learn over the next week would do more than just change company policy. It would challenge everything he believed about success, family, and redemption. It would unravel a 20-year-old conspiracy and force him to confront the true cost of corporate ambition. But for now, he simply nodded at Sarah and moved toward the malfunctioning sensor array, the same type his father had originally designed, while the conversation behind him continued, unaware of how its revelations were already beginning to reshape the future of precision auto parts and the lives of everyone who worked there. David Chen's corner office on the 47th floor whispered power in a language only corporate America truly understood. A $40,000 hand-carved mahogany desk anchored the room, its surface pristine except for a single framed photo turned face down, a habit he'd maintained for 20 years. Behind his ergonomic chair, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's eye view of Detroit, the city that had built his family's legacy and then, with equal efficiency, torn it apart. The morning sun caught his reflection in the polished glass. At 45, he looked every inch the CEO Forbes had dubbed the machine whisperer for his ability to turn struggling manufacturing plants into profit powerhouses. His custom suit cost more than most of his factory workers made in 2 months, a fact that had never bothered him until the latest employee satisfaction reports landed on his desk like a time bomb. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Chen. Linda Marshall, his executive assistant of 15 years, appeared in the doorway. Her expression carried that particular mix of respect and concern he'd come to recognize as her bad news face. "The board's waiting in the war room. And, sir, Mr. Bradford wants to discuss the latest turnover numbers." David's jaw tightened. Thomas Bradford, the board chairman, had been with Precision Auto Parts longer than David had been alive. The old man had weathered every corporate storm, including the one that had swept David's father out of the company and into obscurity. Some said Bradford kept a list of everyone's secrets. David sometimes wondered if his father's name was still on it. "Send them the preliminary earnings report," David said, straightening his tie in the window's reflection. "I'll be there in 5. As Linda's heels clicked away down the marble corridor, he allowed himself one moment of vulnerability. His fingers brushed the face-down photo frame, but he didn't turn it over. He didn't need to. The image was burned into his memory, himself at 12, sitting on his father's shoulders at the factory's grand opening, both of them beaming at the camera. 3 months later, his father would be escorted from the building by security, accused of cooking the books to hide production flaws. The war room lived up to its name today. 12 board members sat around the gleaming conference table like generals plotting a campaign, their tablets displaying the same troubling statistics: employee satisfaction down 23%, turnover up 17%, maintenance requests backlogged by 6 months. The factory floor, the heart of their operation, was showing signs of cardiac arrest. David! Bradford's voice carried the weight of 4 decades in corporate leadership. He sat at the far end of the table, his silver hair catching the morning light. These numbers tell a story, don't they? The same story your father refused to hear 20 years ago. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. David kept his face neutral, a skill he'd perfected during those dark days after the scandal. Actually, Thomas, they tell a different story. One about disconnect between leadership and workforce, which is why I'm proposing something unprecedented. He tapped his tablet, and the room's screens filled with his proposal. The board members' expressions ranged from shock to intrigue as they read the details of Operation Ghost Worker, his plan to go undercover as a maintenance trainee in his own factory. "Have you lost your mind?" Margaret Wu, head of HR, was the first to speak. "The liability alone is manageable," David cut in, "but the cost of doing nothing isn't. We're losing skilled workers faster than we can train replacements. The old sensor systems, my father's designs, are showing critical wear. Middle management keeps deferring maintenance to hit quarterly targets. I need to see the reality. On the ground, not another PowerPoint deck full of sanitized data." Bradford's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your father always said the best way to understand a machine was to work alongside it. But David..." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Some machines have ghosts in them, old grievances, buried truths. Are you sure you want to risk stirring those up?" David met his gaze steadily. "What I want, Thomas, is to understand why the most profitable factory in our network is bleeding talent like a stuck pig. If that means getting my hands dirty, so be it." He turned to address the whole board. "1 week, I go in as Michael Wong, new maintenance trainee. No special treatment, no shortcuts, just eyes and ears on the ground." The board's approval came with reluctance and conditions, but it came. As the room cleared, Bradford lingered behind. "Your father was brilliant with machines," he said quietly. "But he never understood that sometimes the most dangerous parts of a system are the ones you can't see until you're right on top of them. Be careful down there, David. The past has a way of catching up, especially on the factory floor." David watched him go, then turned to stare out at the factory buildings sprawling below. From up here, they looked like perfect boxes, all clean lines and ordered efficiency. But he knew better now. Knew that somewhere in those buildings, buried, under 20 years of corporate evolution, lay answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. Questions about loyalty, truth, and the real price of success. His father used to say that every machine tells a story if you know how to listen. Starting Monday, David would finally learn what stories his father's old factory had been trying to tell him all these years. He just hoped he was ready for the truth they contained. Sarah Martinez's voice crackled through her radio, breaking the monotonous hum of the factory floor. "Control room, we've got abnormal readings on sensor array C7. Request immediate diagnostic." "Check." She glanced at her new trainee, Michael Wong, who stood awkwardly clutching his maintenance manual. Something about him seemed off, his hands too smooth for a career maintenance worker, his stance too rigid for someone used to crawling around machinery. The response from control room came back garbled, masked by the whine of nearby conveyor. "Belts." Sarah adjusted her radio frequency, years of experience telling her something wasn't right. The old sensor arrays had been acting up more frequently lately, their aging circuits struggling to keep pace with increased production demands. "Copy that, Control. Running preliminary checks now." She turned to Michael. "All right, newbie. First, lesson in factory maintenance. Always trust your gut. These sensors..." She patted the metal housing of the nearest array. "They're like old war horses. Been here longer than most of our workforce. Designed by..." She caught herself, remembering the unspoken rule about mentioning the old Chen legacy. The factory floor stretched around them like a mechanical maze. Morning light filtered through high windows, catching dust motes that danced. Above the production lines, workers moved with practiced efficiency, their actions choreographed by years of routine and the steady rhythm of machinery. Michael stepped closer to the sensor panel, his eyes scanning the readouts with unexpected intensity. "The calibration seems off," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made Sarah pause. "Look at the stress distribution patterns." Before she could respond, a deep, groaning sound echoed through the factory. Metal under pressure, a sound every experienced maintenance worker dreaded. Warning lights began flashing across the sensor array's display panel, their urgent red glow reflecting off Michael's face. "Everyone clear the area!" Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the mechanical symphony. Workers began backing away from the production line, their faces showing the practiced calm of those used to equipment malfunctions. But this felt different. The sensors were reporting stress patterns Sarah had never seen before. Then Michael did something that changed everything. Without waiting for instructions, he stepped forward and began inputting commands into the control, a panel. His fingers moved with the certainty of someone intimately familiar with the system's architecture. "What are you doing?" Sarah demanded, reaching to stop him. "These systems require authorized..." "Initiating emergency shutdown protocol." "CT7," he responded, his voice clipped and professional. "If we don't redistribute the load gradually, the entire production line could..." Sarah felt her breath catch. CT7. The Chen Protocol. A safety procedure developed by the factory's original chief engineer, one that hadn't been used in nearly 2 decades. A procedure that wasn't included in any current maintenance manuals. The warning lights stabilized, then gradually dimmed as the production line wound down in a controlled sequence. Around them, the familiar industrial cacophony faded to an eerie quiet, broken only by the soft hum of auxiliary systems. Workers gathered at a safe distance, whispering among themselves. Sarah stared at her supposed trainee, really seeing him for the first time. The way he carried himself, the confidence in his movements, the familiar set of his jaw beneath the obviously fake mustache. "Only 2 people ever knew that shutdown sequence," she said quietly, her mind racing back 20 years to when she was just starting in maintenance. The man who designed these systems and Michael, if that was really his name, turned to face her. For a moment, his eyes held the same intensity she remembered from another Chen, from company photos, yellowed with age and stories whispered in break rooms. "We should check the auxiliary readings," he said, his voice carefully neutral. But his hands, still resting on the control panel his father had designed, trembled slightly. Standard procedure after any emergency shutdown. Sarah nodded slowly, playing along for now, but her mind was already spinning with implications. After 20 years of corporate silence about the Chen scandal, after watching a brilliant engineer's reputation be destroyed overnight, the truth had finally started to malfunction in ways that couldn't be ignored. The question was, what would happen when the rest of the factory realized their new maintenance trainee was actually the CEO who'd inherited his father's company but never questioned his father's disgrace? A loud bang from the factory floor made everyone jump. Through the office window, they could see workers gathering around one of the auxiliary control panels, which was now emitting sparks. The system's protest against the emergency shutdown was escalating. "Ms. Martinez," Bradford said, not taking his eyes off Michael, "why don't you handle that situation? Mr. Wong and I need to discuss his extensive knowledge of obsolete protocols." Sarah hesitated, looking between them. The factory's rhythms felt off, like a machine running just slightly out of alignment. She'd seen that look in Bradford's eyes before, 20 years ago, when security had escorted James Chen from the building. "Actually," a new voice said, from the doorway, "I think we all need to stay right here." Frank Rodriguez stood in the entrance, his maintenance uniform worn and stained from years of service. He'd officially retired last month, but apparently he had one more shift to work. "The sensors didn't fail today," Rodriguez continued, holding up a battered laptop. "They worked exactly as designed, as James Chen designed them. They detected and prevented a catastrophic system failure that someone tried very hard to cause." Bradford's face drained of color. "You retired." "I did," Rodriguez agreed, setting his laptop on Sarah's desk. "Gave me lots of time to analyze 20 years of maintenance logs. Funny thing about digital records, they leave traces, even when someone tries to delete them. Like production quotas being pushed beyond safety limits right before James Chen reported his concerns, or stress test data being manually altered right before the accident that got him fired." Sarah's computer pinged. Rodriguez had just sent her files, decades of data that told a very different story than the one in the company records. She opened the first document, and her breath caught. On her screen was a memo dated 1 week before James Chen's firing, warning about unauthorized changes to the system's safety protocols. The memo was signed by Thomas Bradford. "I think," Michael said quietly, reaching up to peel away his fake mustache, "we need to have a conversation about what really happened 20 years ago." Bradford's hand twitched toward his phone, but Rodriguez stepped forward. "The board's already been notified. They're on their way. And Mr. Bradford, they've seen the files." Outside the office, the factory hummed with the sound of thousands of moving parts working in precision, each one following the paths laid out by their original designer. And in that small office, surrounded by the ghosts of old decisions and buried truths, the machine of corporate deception was finally starting to break down. The maintenance office had grown eerily quiet, like the calm before an industrial storm. Sarah watched Bradford's face cycle through emotions, shock, anger, fear, while David Chen stood by her desk, no longer bothering to maintain his disguise. Rodriguez's laptop displayed damning evidence that glowed in the fluorescent light, casting harsh shadows on worn faces. "You don't understand what was at stake," Bradford finally said, his corporate polish cracking to reveal something desperate underneath. "The company was on the verge of going public. The IPO would have made millionaires of everyone in upper management. But your father," he jabbed a finger at David, "he was going to ruin everything with his obsession over safety protocols." David picked up a wrench from Sarah's desk, turning it over in his hands with the familiarity of someone who'd grown up around machinery. "Tell me something, Thomas. When you altered those safety parameters, did you understand what you were really doing? Or did you just see numbers that needed to change to make other numbers look better?" The factory sounds filtered through the office windows, the whir of conveyor belts, the hiss of pneumatic systems, the steady rhythm of machines built to last, all of it designed by a man who'd understood that every gear, every sensor, every circuit was ultimately about protecting the people who operated them. "Your father was living in the past," Bradford spat, his composure fully crumbling now. "Manual safety checks, redundant systems, staged shutdowns. Do you know how much those protocols cost us in lost production time? The market demanded efficiency, growth. We offered him a generous severance if he'd just sign off on the changes." Rodriguez moved to the computer, pulling up more files. "I worked alongside James Chen for 15 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of silent witness. Man could spot a failing bearing by its sound from 50 feet away. When he said something wasn't safe, you listened, or at least smart people did." Sarah's radio crackled, more issues with the sensor arrays. The system was still protesting the emergency shutdown, like an organism fighting off an infection. She thought about all the maintenance requests she'd filed over the years, all the warnings about pushing the equipment too hard. How many times had she seen the ghost of James Chen's original design trying to protect them? "Did you know?" David said quietly, still studying the wrench. that my father used to bring me here on Saturdays. He'd show me how everything worked. Teach me about load distribution and failure points. Machines don't lie, he'd say. They tell you when something's wrong, if you know how to listen. He set the wrench down with careful precision. Today, his senses told us something was very wrong, just like they tried to tell him 20 years ago. Linda, who'd been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward with her tablet. The board members are in the executive conference room, Mr. Chen. They're reviewing Mr. Rodriguez's files now, and, she hesitated, there's someone else here to see you? A figure appeared in the doorway, and Sarah heard David's sharp intake of breath. James Chen stood there looking older but unbowed, his eyes taking in the scene with the same analytical precision that had once made him legendary on the factory floor. He'd aged, but there was no mistaking the family resemblance or the way his gaze immediately went to the sensor readouts on Sarah's screen. "The CT7 protocol," he said, his voice rougher than Sarah remembered, but still carrying that note of quiet authority. "You remembered." "Hard to forget," David replied, something cracking in his CEO facade. "You drilled it into my head every weekend. Always give the system time to rebalance. Rushing a shutdown is like throwing a car into reverse at full speed." They finished together. Bradford had backed against the wall, his face ashen. "This is impossible. You signed an NDA. The settlement agreement became void," Rodriguez cut in, "the moment we found evidence of criminal negligence. Did you really think James wouldn't keep copies of everything? That he wouldn't protect himself after what you did to him?" The old engineer moved to the sensor display, his fingers hovering over the readouts with familiar reverence. "I designed these systems to last," he said, not looking at Bradford. "Built-in protections you never found, redundancies you couldn't override. Every time you pushed them too hard, they logged it. Every altered parameter, every ignored warning, all of it, waiting for someone to finally listen." Sarah watched. David struggled to maintain his composure. She'd seen countless machines break down over the years, but watching the carefully constructed wall between father and son crack was something else entirely. 20 years of doubt and misunderstanding were giving way, like metal finally yielding to too much pressure. "The board will need our testimony," Rodriguez said, breaking the moment. "All of us, starting with why a routine maintenance check today revealed tampering that goes back 2 decades. James Chen turned from the sensor display, facing Bradford, with the same steady gaze that had once challenged board members to put safety before profits. "Machines don't lie, Thomas. They never did. They just needed someone to finally hear what they've been trying to tell us." Outside the office, the factory continued its mechanical symphony, each note carrying echoes of its original design. But now, for the first time in 20 years, all of its components, human and mechanical, were finally working in harmony with the truth. The executive conference room felt like a pressure cooker about to blow. The board members sat around the mahogany table, their faces illuminated by the glow of tablets displaying Rodriguez's files. At the head of the table, Margaret Wu from HR had taken temporary control, her usual polished demeanor showing cracks as she scrolled through 20 years of manipulated data. "These maintenance logs," she said, looking up as David entered with his father, "they're like reading a novel written in machine code. Every time the system was pushed beyond its safety limits, James's original sensors recorded it. They were literally crying out for help." Bradford had been seated in a corner, flanked by 2 members of corporate security. The silver-haired executive who'd once commanded the room with his presence now seemed to shrink under the weight of exposed lies. His perfectly pressed suit looked suddenly ill-fitting, like borrowed authority being repossessed. "You have to understand the pressure we were under," Bradford began, but David cut him off. "Pressure?" David's laugh held no humor. "Let's talk about pressure, Thomas. The kind that builds up when you force machinery to run beyond its safety. Tolerances. The kind that turns factories into time bombs, the kind that gets people killed. James Chen moved to the conference room's windows, looking out at his factory, still his in every way that mattered to the machines humming below. 3 workers died in the Miller Components factory collapse in '98, he said quietly. Same modifications to their safety protocols that you tried to implement here. I found the connection, didn't I? That's why you had to move so quickly to discredit me. Rodriguez stepped forward, opening a new file on the main display screen. Found this buried in the archived server backups, emails between Bradford and the Miller Components executives discussing how to optimize their production systems. Same language, same modifications, same disregard for basic safety principles. The board members murmured among themselves, their expressions shifting from shock to anger. Sarah noticed how some of them couldn't meet James Chen's eyes, perhaps remembering their own silence when he'd been escorted from the building 2 decades ago. The IPO wasn't just about making us rich, Bradford said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. We were competing with overseas manufacturers. Their costs were lower, their production faster. If we didn't adapt. James turned from the window, and Sarah saw decades of pent-up fury in his eyes. You mean like how 3 families had to adapt to losing their loved ones at Miller Components? Or how my son had to adapt to believing his father was a criminal? Those kinds of adaptations. Linda appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. We're receiving calls from every shift supervisor, the sensor arrays. They're all showing similar stress patterns to this morning's incident. It's like they're speaking in unison now. David moved to the display, studying the incoming data. They're not just speaking, he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. They're testifying. Dad, these patterns, they're repeating the same. Sequences from 20 years ago, aren't they? The ones you documented before they forced you out? James joined his son at the screen, and for a moment, Sarah saw them as they must have been 2 decades ago. Father and son, united by their understanding of how machines could speak truth to power. The systems are running a self-diagnostic, James explained. It's an embedded protocol I designed, meant to activate if certain parameters were repeatedly exceeded. Think of it as a black box for industrial equipment. A black box that's been recording everything for 20 years, Rodriguez added. Every override, every disabled safety feature, every instance of the system being pushed past its limits, all of it, waiting for someone to finally pay attention. Bradford stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is absurd. You can't expect anyone to believe that machines are somehow providing evidence. I moved heaven and earth to build this company into what it is today. I made decisions that got people killed. David's voice cut through Bradford's protests like a blade, destroyed an innocent man's reputation, forced a son to spend 20 years believing his father was a fraud. He turned to the board members. The question isn't whether to believe the machines. The question is why we ever stopped listening to the man who taught them to protect us. Margaret Wu cleared her throat. The evidence is overwhelming, Mr. Bradford. The board is hereby suspending you pending a full investigation. Security will escort you to clear out your office. She turned to James Chen. Mr. Chen, on behalf of the board, I cannot begin to express... Save it, James said, but without bitterness. The machines have said everything that needs to be said. What matters now is making sure no other family goes through what mine did. As Bradford was led from the room, David watched his father run his hand along the sensor readout display, a gesture so familiar it made his throat tight. 20 years of distance began to collapse, like a failed bearing finally giving way to truth. The factory, David said, it needs its original engineer back. These systems, they're still speaking your language. James looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps seeing for the first time how the boy who'd once sat on his shoulders had grown into a man capable of hearing the truth in mechanical whispers. They're speaking our language, son. They Always were. We just needed to learn how to listen together. The sensor displays continued their silent testimony, their rhythmic data patterns telling a story of patience, persistence, and the ultimate triumph of truth over time. In the end, the machines had kept their promise, protecting not just the workers on the factory floor, but the very integrity of the family that had taught them how to speak. News travels fast in a factory, especially when it involves the CEO showing up in disguise and the return of a legendary engineer whose name had been whispered in breakrooms for 2 decades. As word spread through the facility, workers began gathering in small groups, sharing stories passed down like industrial folklore about the days when James Chen had walked these floors. In the main control room, James stood before the master control panel, his weathered hands hovering over displays that showed the factory's vital signs. David watched his father work, noticing how the older man's movements carried the same precise grace he remembered from childhood, like a conductor leading a mechanical orchestra. The system's showing signs of cumulative stress, James said, pointing to a pattern of peaks and valleys on one of the screens. They've been running these lines at 130% capacity for months. The safety protocols I designed, the ones that weren't disabled, have been working overtime to prevent catastrophic failure. Sarah leaned in, her maintenance expertise helping her translate the data. These spikes here, she pointed, they started right after the last quarterly earnings call, when the board pushed for increased production targets. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the control room windows, they could see Bradford being escorted toward the exit by security. But instead of leaving quietly, the former chairman had stopped, turning to address the gathering crowd of workers. "Everything I did was to keep this company competitive." Bradford's voice carried through the glass. "Ask yourselves why we're the only American auto parts manufacturer still operating at a profit. You think that happened by following James Chen's outdated safety protocols?" David moved toward the door, but his father caught his arm. "Wait," James said softly. "Listen." From the factory floor, voices began to rise, not in support of Bradford, but in opposition. Workers stepped forward, each with a story to tell. "My father worked the line when Mr. Chen was here," one woman called out, said it was the only time he felt the company actually cared if he made it home at night. Another voice joined in. "Remember the Anderson accident last year? Those sensors you tampered with could have prevented that. Anderson's still doing physical therapy." Rodriguez emerged from the crowd, his laptop open. "I've got maintenance requests here going back 5 years, all warning about the exact issues Mr. Chen predicted would happen if his systems were modified. All of them denied by upper management because they'd impact production quotas." Bradford's corporate mask finally cracked completely. "You don't understand. The shareholders, the market pressures, we were fighting for survival. Chen's protocols would have bankrupted us." "Like Miller Components?" James's voice cut through the chaos as he stepped out of the control room. The crowd parted for him like water. They chose profit over safety too. How'd that work out for the families of the dead workers? The factory seemed to hold its breath. Even the machine's usual rhythm felt muted, as if the very infrastructure was listening to its creator confront the man who'd tried to remake it in his own image. "The truth about Miller Components," James continued, his voice carrying the weight, "of 20 years of silence wasn't just about altered safety protocols. Show them, Frank." Rodriguez connected his laptop to a large display screen used for shift announcements. Emails appeared, dozens of them, dating back to before James's firing. Correspondence between Bradford and Miller Components executives, discussing how to hide safety violations, how to discredit whistleblowers, how to make it look like equipment failures were due to operator error rather than disabled safety systems. "I kept copies of everything," James explained, addressing not just Bradford but all the assembled workers. encrypted them into the very systems you tried to modify. Every time someone tampered with a safety protocol, the sensors didn't just log the change. They archived every related document, every email, every attempt to cover up what was happening. David stepped forward, seeing his father in a new light. The man he'd spent 20 years doubting had built not just safety systems, but a mechanical witness protection program, one that had patiently gathered evidence while waiting for someone to finally hear its testimony. "The board is convening an emergency session," Linda announced, hurrying through the crowd. "They're calling for a complete audit of all safety systems and a review of every accident report filed since Mr. Chen's departure." Bradford seemed to physically deflate, his carefully constructed world of corporate deception crumbling around him. But before security could resume escorting him out, James Chen had one more thing to say. "You know what the real difference is between us, Thomas." He gestured at the factory around them. "I built these systems to protect people. You tried to rebuild them to protect profits. But machines, like truth, have a way of breaking free from whatever boxes we try to put them in." The gathered workers erupted in applause, not the polite corporate kind, but the raw, honest appreciation of people who understood exactly what was at stake. David watched his father acknowledge their support with a simple nod, seeing in that gesture the same quiet dignity that had once taught him how to listen to machines, speak truth to power. As Bradford was finally led away, David noticed something remarkable. The factory's rhythm had changed. The machines hummed with renewed purpose, as if they too understood that their long vigil was finally over. The truth they'd been programmed to protect had finally found its voice, speaking through circuits and sensors to tell a story of loyalty, betrayal, and the ultimate victory of integrity over expedience. In the quiet of her small office tucked away in the factory's documentation center, Eleanor Martinez, Sarah's mother and the facility's longest-serving administrative assistant, watched the security footage of Bradford's exit on her computer screen. At 67, she'd seen CEOs come and go, policies change and shift, but she'd never forgotten the day James Chen had been escorted out. She'd been the one to pack up his office after hours, carefully preserving what others might have thrown away. Now her fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling up files that hadn't seen the light of day in 20 years. The younger workers might have their smartphones and tablets, but Eleanor understood the power of paper trails and physical records, the kind that couldn't be deleted with a keystroke. A knock at her door made her look up. David Chen stood in the doorway, looking somehow both more and less like a CEO now that his disguise was gone. "Ms. Martinez, Rodriguez mentioned you might have something we need to see." Eleanor smiled, gesturing to a chair. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right questions. Tell me, Mr. Chen, did you ever wonder why your father's personal items never made it to the storage auction after his firing? The ones Bradford ordered disposed of." David's expression shifted as Eleanor reached under her desk, pulling out a dusty banker's box sealed with evidence tape. "You kept his things all this time?" "Some people understand machines," Eleanor said, carefully breaking the seal. "I understand. Paperwork, the stories it tells, the secrets it keeps." She began laying out items on her desk, engineering notebooks, personal correspondence, and most importantly, a leather-bound journal with the Miller Components logo embossed on its cover. "Your father didn't just stumble onto the safety violations. At Miller Components," Eleanor explained, opening the journal to a marked page, "he was asked to consult on their system upgrades. What he found there, well, let's just say Bradford wasn't the only one who wanted him silenced." David leaned forward, reading entries dating back to the months before his father's dismissal. The journal detailed not just technical specifications, but meetings, conversations, and a growing web of corporate corruption that stretched far beyond one factory's walls. "There's more," Eleanor continued, pulling up files on her computer. Every email, every memo, every change specification had to go through administrative processing. We're the invisible ones, you see, the ones no one thinks to guard their words around. For 20 years, I've been gathering pieces of this puzzle, waiting for the right moment. The door opened again, and James Chen himself stepped in. Eleanor rose, smoothing her skirt with suddenly trembling hands. Mr. Chen, I kept everything just like you asked, even the things you couldn't tell anyone you were leaving behind. James moved to the desk, his fingers brushing the journal's worn cover. Eleanor, you were the only one who knew, weren't you, that the records I supposedly destroyed were actually duplicated and distributed to 5 different storage locations, she finished. Insurance, you called it. Protection for the workers who'd be left behind. She turned to David. Your father didn't just walk away, Mr. Chen. He left behind a time bomb of truth, ticking away in filing cabinets and archived servers, waiting for the right moment to detonate. David picked up one of the engineering notebooks, its pages dense, with his father's familiar handwriting. But why wait so long? This evidence could have cleared your name years ago. Because it wasn't just about clearing my name, James replied softly. Bradford's corruption went deeper than one factory, one company. We needed to let him build his house of cards high enough that when it fell, it would take down the entire network of people willing to trade lives for profits. Eleanor nodded, pulling up more files on her screen. Every time Bradford pushed for efficiency improvements at another facility, we documented it. Every time safety protocols were overridden, we added it to the record. A complete history of systematic endangerment, all leading back to Miller Components and the deaths Bradford tried to bury. The censors, David said, understanding dawning in his eyes. They weren't just recording data, they were building a case, piece by piece, year by year. Machines don't forget, James agreed, and neither do people like Eleanor, who understand that sometimes the most powerful revolution is simply keeping careful records and waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Eleanor began laying out more documents, safety inspection reports, maintenance logs, internal memos that painted a damning picture of corporate negligence spanning 2 decades. Your undercover visit was the catalyst we needed, she explained. To David, it proved that even after 20 years, the truth was still there in the systems, waiting to be heard. Bradford's reaction to the CT7 protocol just confirmed what we already knew. He never understood that the real fail-safes weren't in the machinery, but in the people who believed in your father's vision. Through her window, Eleanor could see workers gathering in small groups, sharing their own stories and memories. The factory's rhythm had changed, becoming something more harmonious, as if machines and people were finally speaking the same language of truth. We should get these to the board, David said, carefully gathering the documents. But before they left, he turned to Eleanor. Thank you for being the guardian of truth when everyone else wanted to bury it. Eleanor smiled, touching the old banker's box with something like affection. Some things are worth waiting for, Mr. Chen. Some truths need time to ripen, like fruit on a tree. Today, we finally get to harvest what your father planted 20 years ago. The factory hummed around them, its sounds no longer just the noise of production, but the steady heartbeat of justice finally finding its rhythm. The executive boardroom had transformed into something resembling a war room. Every surface was covered with documents from Eleanor's collection, each piece telling part of a story that had waited 20 years to be heard. The board members moved between the displays like museum visitors, their faces showing varying degrees of shock and dismay as they absorbed the scope of Bradford's deception. Margaret Wu stood at the head of the table, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, the SEC needs to see this immediately. No, this goes far beyond standard corporate misconduct. She paused, listening. How many other facilities? According to these records, at least 7. David sat beside his father, both men poring over the Miller Components Journal. James's finger traced a line of his own handwriting from 2 decades ago. System modifications requested by TB would reduce failure detection time below critical threshold. Implementation could result in catastrophic failure. 3 weeks later, James said quietly, 3 workers died when a support beam failed. The official report blamed metal fatigue, but I knew. His voice trailed off as he turned the page, revealing a series of calculations that had haunted him for 20 years. Rodriguez burst into the room, his laptop cradled like precious cargo. "You need to see this," he said, hooking his computer to the main display screen. "I've been running analytics on the sensor data Eleanor preserved. It's not just recording violations, it's predicting them." With the screen filled with flowing data streams, patterns emerging like digital constellations, Sarah leaned forward, her maintenance expertise letting her see what others might miss. "These are stress forecasts," she breathed. "The system wasn't just logging problems, it was trying to warn us about future failures." "Like a check engine light for the whole factory," David mused, watching the patterns shift. "But Bradford disabled the warning systems, didn't he?" James nodded, pulling out another document from Eleanor's collection. This memo from 2003 ordered a streamlining of the alert protocols. They didn't just ignore the warnings, they silenced them completely. Linda appeared in the doorway, her usual composure shaken. "Mr. Chen, both Mr. Chens, there's something you need to know. Bradford's been making calls from security's holding room. We've tracked them to executives at 3 other manufacturing facilities." "He's warning them," Eleanor said from her corner, where she'd been quietly organizing more evidence. "The same people who helped him bury the truth about Miller Components. They all use the same playbook. Disable safety protocols, discredit whistleblowers, hide the evidence." David stood, moving to the window that overlooked the factory floor. Workers continued their shifts below, unaware that their lives had been repeatedly put at risk by men in distant offices playing with numbers they didn't understand. "How many?" he asked, not turning around. "How many other facilities modified their systems based on Bradford's recommendations?" Rodriguez pulled up a new screen of data. "According to these maintenance logs, at least 15 in North America alone. All of them implementing the same dangerous modifications that killed those workers at Miller Components." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about one factory, one father and son, or even one corrupt executive. This was about an entire industry built on compromised safety standards and silenced warnings. "There's something else," Eleanor said, lifting a sealed envelope from the bottom of her box. "Something I was only supposed to share if things went this far." She handed the envelope to James, who opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a single photograph, taken at what appeared to be a corporate retreat. In it, Bradford stood with a group of executives, all from companies that had later implemented his dangerous modifications. But it was the date stamp that made David's breath catch, 1 week before the Miller Components accident. "They knew," James said, his voice heavy with 2 decades of vindication. "They all knew what would happen, and they did it anyway. Because the cost of a few lives lost was less than the cost of maintaining proper safety standards." Margaret Wu ended her phone call, turning to address the room. "The SEC is sending a team. The FBI's Corporate Crimes Division is also interested, especially given the multi-state nature of these violations." Sarah, who had been studying the sensor readouts, suddenly straightened. "These patterns, they're not just historical. The system is showing similar stress indicators in real time, right now, at 3 other facilities owned by the companies." In that photograph, "History repeating itself," James murmured, but David was already moving. "Get me contact information for those facilities," he ordered Linda. "Then call our legal team." We're not just going to expose what happened 20 years ago, we're going to stop it from happening again. The factory hummed below them, its rhythms now carrying a different meaning. Every whir, click and hum was the voice of a system that had never stopped trying to protect its workers, even when those in power had tried to silence it. Now finally, those mechanical whispers would become a roar of truth that would echo through boardrooms across the country. Eleanor watched father and son working side by side, their movements synchronized like well-maintained gears. She'd kept these secrets for 20 years, maintaining her own quiet vigil alongside the machines. Now, as she began preparing copies of evidence for investigators, she allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes the most powerful moments of justice came not with a bang, but with the steady, unstoppable rhythm of truth finally breaking free. The factory's emergency alarm system blared to life, its warning lights casting red shadows across worried faces. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent messages from every sector of the facility. The stress patterns Rodriguez had identified weren't just predictions anymore, they were becoming reality. 3 production lines showing critical stress levels, Sarah reported, her fingers flying across the control panel. The system's trying to initiate automatic shutdown, but someone's overriding it remotely. James Chen moved to the main console, his expression darkening as he read the data streams. Bradford, he must have given his access codes to someone on the outside. They're trying to push the system past its breaking point. If these lines fail at full production speed, the whole main floor could collapse, David finished, remembering his father's lessons about load distribution and cascade failures. He grabbed his phone, barking orders to security. Lock down all external network access now. But it was too late. On the screens above them, production speeds were ramping up beyond safety limits. Warning indicators flashed from green to yellow, to red, like autumn leaves changing colors in fast forward. The machines below groaned under the strain, their usual synchronized hum becoming a desperate chorus of metal under stress. "We need to evacuate," Margaret Wu insisted, already reaching for the facility's emergency protocols. "We can't risk—" "No," James and David said simultaneously. They shared a look of understanding before James continued. "If we initiate a full shutdown now, with these stress levels, the sudden stop could trigger the very collapse we're trying to prevent." Eleanor burst into the control room, clutching a faded technical manual. "I found it. The original emergency procedures you designed for cascade prevention, the ones Bradford had removed from the official documentation." James took the manual, his hands steady despite the chaos around them. The pages fell open to a well-worn section, as if the book itself remembered the most crucial information. "The CT-7 protocol was just the beginning," he explained, already inputting commands. "There's a deeper level of system protection built into the original programming, something I never documented officially because I feared exactly this kind of sabotage." Sarah watched the code flowing across his screen, her eyes widening. "You built a ghost protocol into the base system architecture, something that couldn't be overridden because officially it doesn't exist." "A mechanical dead man's switch," David realized, remembering late-night conversations from his childhood about fail-safe systems and backup plans. Insurance against exactly this kind of situation. Through the control room windows, they could see workers moving with practiced efficiency to pre-assigned safety positions, not evacuating, but preparing for whatever came next. Years of drills and safety training, the kind James had insisted on before his ousting, were paying off in this critical moment. "Bradford's people are fighting the system protocols," Rodriguez reported from his station. "They're trying to force their way through every safety barrier we put up." James's fingers never stopped moving across the keyboard, but he spoke with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what his creation could do. "Let them try. They're so focused on overriding what they can see, they don't realize they're actually triggering the very protection systems I designed to stop them. The factory floor had become a battlefield of competing commands, external forces trying to push the machinery past its limits, while hidden protocols fought to maintain control. The sound of straining metal filled the air, punctuated by the staccato alerts of sensors reporting increasingly dangerous conditions. "Dad," David said quietly, watching the stress indicators climb higher, "if this doesn't work—" "It'll work," James replied, entering one final command sequence. "Because the most important thing I built into these systems wasn't the safety, protocols, or the backup systems." He looked up at his son, decades of unspoken pride in his eyes. It was the understanding that protecting lives is more important than protecting profits. The machines know that, even if some people forgot. As if responding to his words, the factory's rhythm suddenly changed. The dangerous whine of overtaxed machinery transformed into something more controlled, more purposeful. One by one, production lines began executing a perfectly choreographed sequence of power redistribution. "Look at this," Sarah breathed, pointing to the readouts. "The system isn't just preventing a collapse, it's actively redistributing the stress loads, using the very momentum of the override, attempts to power its own safety protocols." David watched in amazement as his father's creation demonstrated exactly why he had been considered a genius in his field. The machines moved in perfect harmony, each one compensating for the others, turning a potential disaster into a masterclass in industrial ballet. "Bradford's people are losing their connection," Rodriguez reported, a note of triumph in his voice. "The systems locked them out completely. We're regaining full control." As the emergency lights faded and the regular hum of properly functioning machinery resumed, James finally allowed himself to relax slightly. 20 years ago, they thought they could silence the truth by silencing me. But they never understood. The truth was built into every circuit, every sensor, every safety protocol. The machines remembered, even when people tried to forget. David placed a hand on his father's shoulder, feeling the slight tremor that belied the older man's calm exterior. They both knew that what had just happened wasn't just about preventing a mechanical failure. It was about proving that integrity, once built into a system, could withstand any attempt to corrupt it. Through the windows, they could see workers returning to their stations, their faces showing relief mixed with a new understanding. The factory had just demonstrated something profound, that the systems designed to protect them had never stopped fighting for their safety, even when the people in charge had tried to compromise it. The factory's break room had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. FBI agents sat alongside SEC investigators, their suit jackets draped over break-room chairs, paper coffee cups scattered among stacks of evidence. At the center of it all, Bradford sat in handcuffs, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkled, his corporate mask finally shattered. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Agent Diana Chen, no relation, said, reviewing her notes. "You didn't just try to override safety protocols in one facility. You created a template for systematic safety violations that you sold to other manufacturers as efficiency consulting." Bradford's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but before he could intervene, another voice joined the conversation. "It went beyond consulting. Victor Martinez, Sarah's uncle and a former Miller Components worker, stepped into the break room. He walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the accident that had killed 3 of his co-workers. The room fell silent as Victor approached the table. 20 years of carrying survivors' guilt had etched deep lines in his face, but today his eyes were clear and focused. "I was there when they implemented Bradford's efficiency improvements at Miller," Watched them disable the same safety systems Mr. Chen had designed for our facility. Some of us tried to speak up, but speaking up was bad for business, James Chen finished, entering with David and Eleanor. He carried the old Miller Components Journal, its pages now marked with evidence tags. Victor here was the one who first contacted me about the modifications. He saw what was happening and tried to prevent it. Bradford's composure cracked further. You knew each other? Before the accident. Of course they did, Eleanor said, pulling another document from her seemingly endless collection. Here's the email chain. Victor warning James about the safety overrides, James documenting the potential risks, and you. She slid a final paper across the table. You ordering IT to delete all records of their communications 3 days before the accident. Agent Chen leaned forward. You didn't just cover up violations after the fact. You actively worked to hide evidence that could have prevented worker deaths. The break room door opened again, admitting Sarah and Rodriguez. They carried printed readouts from the recent system attack. We've traced the override attempts, Rodriguez reported. 4 different IP addresses, all leading back to manufacturing facilities that implemented Bradford's protocols. They were trying to force our systems to fail to hide evidence of their own violations. But instead, Sarah added, a note of pride in her voice, they triggered Dad's hidden safety systems, the ones he built because he knew someday someone might try exactly this kind of sabotage. David watched his father examine the readouts, seeing the same focused intelligence that had designed these systems 2 decades ago. The machines remembered, James said quietly. Even when people tried to make them forget, they remembered how they were meant to protect, not endanger. Victor limped to the window, looking out at the factory floor where workers were returning to their stations. 3 people died at Miller because we didn't listen to warnings like these. 3 families lost their loved ones because profit margins were more important than people's lives. Bradford finally spoke, his voice hoarse. You don't understand. The pressures we were under, international competition, shareholder demands, market expectations. No, Victor cut him off. You don't understand. I had to watch good people die because of your efficiency improvements, had to live with knowing I could have done more to stop it. But Mr. Chen here? He gestured to James. He did try to stop it, and you destroyed his life for it. Agent Chen closed her notebook. Mr. Bradford, given the multi-state nature of these violations and the clear evidence of premeditated corporate fraud leading to worker deaths, I'd advise you to start cooperating. Your efficiency consulting has put thousands of workers at risk across multiple facilities. Eleanor stepped forward, placing another box on the table. These are records from 15 other facilities that implemented Mr. Bradford's modifications. Each one shows the same pattern: disabled safety protocols, ignored warnings, silenced whistleblowers. And now, David added, each one of those facilities will need to be inspected, their systems restored to proper safety standards. He turned to his father. We'll need someone who understands the original protocols, someone who can help rebuild what Bradford tried to destroy. James looked around the room, at Sarah, who had maintained his systems despite pressure to compromise them, at Rodriguez, who had gathered evidence while appearing to retire, at Eleanor, who had preserved the truth for 20 years, and at his son, who had finally learned to listen to both machines and conscience. The rebuilding, he said, won't just be about machinery. It's about restoring faith. Faith in systems designed to protect, in companies meant to provide more than just profits, in people willing to stand up for what's right. Victor nodded, understanding in his eyes. 20 years is a long time to wait for justice, but today we honor those who didn't live to see it. As FBI agents led Bradford away, David noticed how the factory's rhythm had changed. Stronger, clearer, more purposeful. like truth itself had been built into its very foundations, waiting all these years to finally break free. In the softening light of late afternoon, the factory's auxiliary conference room had become a temporary archive. Photos, documents, and maintenance logs covered every surface, each piece telling part of a story that stretched back 2 decades. But it was the newest edition that held everyone's attention, a dusty VHS tape that Eleanor had just pulled from the depths of her final storage box. Security footage, she explained, setting up an old TV VCR combo that looked like it belonged in a museum. From the day James was escorted out, Bradford ordered all copies destroyed, but she smiled. Well, let's just say some of us believed in keeping backups of the backups. The room grew quiet as grainy footage flickered to life. There was James, 20 years younger, but with the same dignified bearing, being led through the factory floor by security. Workers stood at their stations, many with heads bowed, not in shame, David realized now, but in respect. Some even reached out to touch James's shoulder as he passed, silent gestures of support that the official record had never mentioned. "Stop the tape," Victor said suddenly. "There, in the background." Eleanor froze the frame. Behind the main scene, partially hidden by a support column, stood Bradford with 2 other men. Even through the grainy footage, their expressions were clear. Not the stern disapproval of executives removing a corrupt engineer, but the nervous tension of men watching their own deception unfold. "I remember those men," Sarah said, leaning closer to the screen. "They visited again after the Miller Components accident. Bradford called it a safety audit, but they spent more time in the server room than on the factory floor. Rodriguez was already typing on his laptop. Cross-referencing with the files we recovered. Got it. Michael Thorne and James Patterson, executive consultants. They helped implement Bradford's efficiency protocols at 12 different facilities. And look at this. Both of them served on the board of directors at Miller Components when the accident happened." "It wasn't just about cutting corners," James said quietly, studying the frozen image of the men who'd helped destroy his reputation. "They were building a network. Each facility that implemented their protocols became part of a larger system of corporate negligence." David watched his father's face, seeing the pieces click together just as they had when troubleshooting complex machinery. The IPO wasn't the real goal, was it? They needed you gone because you could prove the connection between their protocols and worker deaths. "More than that," Eleanor added, pulling up an old financial report. "Every facility that implemented Bradford's modifications showed immediate profit increases. Their stock values jumped, executives got massive bonuses, and worker safety complaints were buried in administrative red tape." The factory hummed around them, its rhythm a constant reminder of the lives at stake. Through the conference room windows, they could see the afternoon shift changing over, workers greeting each other, checking equipment, trusting in systems they hoped would keep them safe. Victor limped to the window, his reflection overlaying the scene below. "You know what the worst part was? After Miller, after we lost good people to their greed, they had the nerve to call it unfortunate but unavoidable equipment failure. Like the machines just decided to give up on their own. Because they never understood the most basic principle of engineering," James replied, moving to stand beside him. "Machines don't just fail. They warn us again and again until either we listen or we force them to break." Sarah's radio crackled. More facilities were reporting similar safety protocol violations. As the investigation expanded, more workers were coming forward with their own stories of disabled safety systems and ignored warnings. "We're going to need a bigger investigation team," Agent Chen said, reviewing the growing list of affected facilities. "This is systemic corruption on a scale we've rarely seen in manufacturing." David had been quiet, studying the frozen image of his father's last day. "All these years," he said finally, "I believed what they told us, believed you'd cut corners, ignored safety protocols. I never thought—" "You were 12, James interrupted gently. "They made sure you saw exactly what they wanted you to see. Just like they did with these machines, hiding warnings behind efficiency reports, burying safety concerns under profit margins." Eleanor started the tape again. The footage continued, showing James's final walk through the facility. He'd helped build, but now, with 20 years of perspective and a room full of evidence, they could see what had really happened that day. Not the exit of a disgraced engineer, but the beginning of a 2-decade struggle between corporate greed and one man's unwavering commitment to worker safety. "Every machine tells a story," James used to say. Today, through grainy security footage and preserved documents, through maintenance logs and sensor data, through the memories of those who never stopped believing in the truth, those stories were finally being heard. And in the factory below, the afternoon shift continued their work, protected by systems that had never forgotten their true purpose, designed by a man who had sacrificed everything to keep them safe. The machines hummed their own kind of testimony, a steady rhythm of truth that no corporate directive could ever fully silence. The evening shift was starting as David walked the factory floor with his father, their footsteps echoing in sync. With the machinery around them, workers nodded as they passed, some stopping to shake James's hand or share a quick story about how his original safety protocols had prevented an accident over the years. "It's like ripples in a pond," James said, pausing to watch a robotic arm move through its careful dance. "Every decision we make, every system we build, creates waves that affect lives we might never see." He reached out to touch a nearby sensor panel, one of the hundreds he'd designed that had quietly protected workers for 2 decades, despite attempts to silence them. Sarah jogged up to them, tablet in hand. "You need to see this," she said, pulling up an email chain that Eleanor had just uncovered. "Remember those consultants from the security tape? Turns out they weren't just helping Bradford implement his protocols. They were selling the same dangerous modifications to facilities in other countries." The implications hit David like a physical force. "How many?" "At least 30 facilities across 12 countries, Sarah replied, scrolling through the data. "But here's the thing, in every single one, your father's original safety systems kept fighting back. Even when they thought they'd disabled them completely, the core protocols kept running in the background, logging violations and preventing worst-case failures." James smiled slightly, the pride of a creator seeing his work vindicate itself. "I designed the systems like a parent child-proofing a house," he explained. "You can't just remove one safety latch and assume the whole place is unsafe. There are always backup measures, hidden protections." They reached the central control station where Rodriguez was working with the FBI's cybercrime unit. Screens displayed a global map dotted with red markers, each one a facility that had implemented Bradford's dangerous modifications. "The pattern's always the same," Rodriguez explained, pulling up comparison charts. "They start with small changes, calling them efficiency improvements. Then they gradually disable more safety features, always hiding behind technical language and profit projections. But look here." He highlighted a series of dates. Every time they pushed too far, James's base protocols would kick in, preventing catastrophic failures. A young FBI tech looked up from her laptop, impressed. "It's like you built a mechanical, immune system, Mr. Chen. No matter how they tried to compromise it, the core programming kept fighting to protect people." "Because that's what machines are supposed to do," James replied. "They're not just tools for making profits. They're extensions of human care and responsibility. Every gear, every circuit, every line of code should serve the people who trust their lives to them." David watched his father talk with the investigators, seeing him through new eyes. The man he'd spent 20 years doubting had built not just safety systems, but a legacy of protection that had saved countless lives across the globe. Linda appeared with more updates from the board. The SEC is freezing assets connected to Bradford's consulting network, she reported. And we're getting calls from other manufacturers asking for help reviewing their safety protocols. They want to know if they've been compromised. They have been, Victor said, joining them with Eleanor. The whole industry was compromised. The moment we started valuing efficiency over human life. But maybe now... He gestured to the workers going about their tasks, protected by systems that had never stopped working as intended. Maybe now we can start rebuilding trust. Eleanor was organizing a new set of documents, evidence of similar safety violations at facilities around the world, but among the technical reports and corporate memos, she'd found something else. Letters from workers' families thanking James for systems that had prevented accidents, kept loved ones safe, given them peace of mind. You know what Bradford never understood? She said, showing them the letters. Safety protocols aren't just numbers in a system. They're parents coming home to their kids, workers growing old enough to retire, families staying whole because someone cared enough to protect them. David felt the weight of this truth settle over him. His father hadn't just designed machines, he'd created guardians, silent protectors that had spent 20 years fighting against corporate greed to keep their human charges safe. We need to do more than just expose what happened, he said. An idea forming. We need to rebuild the whole approach to industrial safety. Show other companies that protecting workers isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. James looked at his son with quiet pride. The machines have been trying to tell us that all along. Every warning signal, every emergency, shutdown, every logged violation, they were all saying the same thing. People matter more than profits. Around them, the factory continued its work, each machine moving with purpose, each safety system standing guard. The truth had finally broken free from 20 years of corporate suppression, carried on waves of data and testimony from both humans and machines. The evening light filtering through high windows caught the dust motes in the air, making them dance like silent witnesses to this moment of revelation. In the end, it wasn't just about exposing past wrongs or bringing criminals to justice. It was about remembering why we build machines in the first place, not to replace human care and responsibility, but to extend and enhance it. The factory cafeteria was quiet at this late hour, most workers having gone home for the day. David sat across from his father at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them. On the table lay a worn photo album that Eleanor had kept safe all these years, memories preserved like mechanical specifications, waiting for the right moment to be reviewed. Mom knew, didn't she? David asked, turning a page to reveal a family photo from the company picnic, taken just weeks before everything fell apart. That's why she always changed the subject when I asked about you. She was protecting me from having to choose sides. James nodded, touching the photo gently. Catherine was always the strongest of us. When Bradford's people started making threats, she insisted I leave without explaining. Said it would be easier for you to hate me than to live in fear. He smiled sadly. She was wrong about that part, but her heart was in the right place. Sarah approached their table, carrying a stack of maintenance logs she'd found in the archives. Sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this. These aren't just routine records. They're like a diary of everything that happened after you left, Mr. Chen. Every time Bradford's team tried to modify your safety protocols, every mysterious system shutdown that prevented accidents. David leaned forward, scanning the logs. Each entry told part of a story, not just of machines being pushed beyond their limits, but of people like Sarah and Rodriguez quietly maintaining James's original vision, keeping his safety standards alive even when they didn't fully understand why. Look at these dates, he said, pointing to a series of entries. Every time they tried to implement Bradford's efficiency improvements, the systems would find ways to resist. It's like they were programmed with a kind of mechanical stubbornness. James chuckled. I used to tell your mother that machines are like children. They remember how they were raised. These systems were built to protect people. That core purpose was written into their very architecture, too deep for anyone to simply override it. Eleanor joined them, carrying yet another box of records. But these weren't technical documents. They were personal letters, cards and photos sent by workers' families over the years. I kept these too, she said, spreading them on the table. Every time your safety systems prevented an accident, every life saved by protocols that refused to be silenced, people wanted to say thank you, even if they didn't know where to send their gratitude. David picked up one letter, dated just 3 years ago. It was from a young woman whose father worked in the stamping department. Dear Mr. Chen, he read, aloud, you don't know me, but your emergency shutdown system saved my dad's life last week. The managers were angry about the lost production time, but our family got to celebrate his birthday together instead of planning a funeral. I don't know where you are now, but thank you for caring enough to build machines that protect people. His voice cracked on the last words. James reached across the table, gripping his son's hand, their first real contact in 20 years. That's why I couldn't just sign off on Bradford's modifications, he said softly. Every time I looked at you, I saw all the other children who deserved to have their parents come home safe. Sarah spread out the maintenance logs alongside the thank you letters, creating a timeline of resistance, mechanical and human. It wasn't just the machines fighting back, she explained. Those of us who believed in your father's principles, we found ways to maintain his standards. Every equipment malfunction that prevented dangerous overrides, every system error that kept safety protocols in place. You were all protecting my father's legacy, David realized, looking at these people who had become a kind of extended family, united by their commitment to putting lives before profits. While I was up in the executive offices believing the official story, you were down here keeping his real story alive. Eleanor pulled one final item from her seemingly bottomless archive, a small, worn notebook. Your mother gave me this before she passed, she told David, said I'd know when it was time to share it. She handed it to James, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside were Catherine's private thoughts recorded over 2 decades. She had documented everything. Bradford's threats, the evidence of corruption, the real reason behind James's departure. But more than that, she had written about her hopes for the future, her belief that someday the truth would emerge and her family would be whole again. She never lost faith, James whispered, reading his late wife's words, even when I wanted to give up, to come back and face whatever consequences Bradford had planned. She kept insisting that the truth would find its way out, just like a properly designed system will always find its way back to balance. David looked around the cafeteria where, years ago, he had eaten lunch with his father as they discussed the poetry in engineering, the art of building machines that served humanity rather than exploiting it. Now, surrounded by evidence of both corporate corruption and unwavering integrity, he understood that his father's greatest design hadn't been the safety protocols or the sensor systems. It had been the network of trust and care that had survived 20 years of attempts to dismantle it. A human machine, built from conscience and courage, that had protected not just workers' lives, but the very truth itself. The sun had set over Detroit, but the Precision Auto Parts factory buzzed with unusual activity. The main conference room, normally reserved for production meetings, had been transformed into something resembling a war room. FBI agents, corporate investigators, and factory workers moved between stations, where different pieces of evidence told parts of a story 2 decades in the making. Think of it like a puzzle, Rodriguez explained to the assembled group, standing before a wall-sized display of data streams. Each safety violation Bradford implemented was like hiding a piece. But James's systems, they were like that friend who takes a photo of the puzzle box before anyone starts mixing up the pieces. Sarah picked up the explanation, pointing to specific data patterns. Every time they tried to push the machines past their safety limits, the system would do something clever. Instead of just shutting down, it would create a kind of digital breadcrumb trail. Look here. She highlighted a series of readings. What looks like random equipment failures were actually the machines documenting their own abuse. Victor limped forward, holding up his old employee badge from Miller Components. "We thought we were alone back then," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "Thought nobody would believe us when we said something wasn't right. But all this time, the machines were keeping track, waiting for someone to finally read their warning signs." At a nearby table, Eleanor had organized 2 decades of physical evidence into clear chronological order. Pay stubs showing impossible, production quotas, maintenance requests that had been repeatedly denied, internal memos warning about safety risks that had been systematically ignored. Bradford didn't just break the machines, she explained to Agent Chen. He tried to break the people who believed in what they were designed to do. But look at these. She pulled out a stack of anonymous maintenance logs. Every time they disabled a safety protocol, someone would find a way to partially restore it. Small acts of rebellion, protecting workers even when it meant risking their jobs. David stood with his father near the central evidence display, watching as years of deception were finally exposed to light. "You didn't just build safety systems," he said quietly. "You built witnesses, every sensor, every circuit. They were all designed to remember." James nodded, touching a nearby control panel with familiar affection. "Machines don't know how to lie," he replied. "They can be modified, corrupted, pushed beyond their limits, but at their core, they'll always try to return to their original purpose, just like people." Linda arrived with a new set of files, records from other facilities that had implemented Bradford's dangerous modifications. "It's staggering," she reported. "Every factory that used his protocols shows the same pattern. Safety systems disabled, warnings ignored, profits prioritized over people. But in each one, we're finding traces of resistance. Maintenance workers who remembered the old standards, engineers who built in secret backups, people who never stopped believing in what Mr. Chen taught them." Margaret Wu had been quietly reviewing financial records in the corner. Now she stood, her face showing a mix of anger and amazement. "The money trail is even worse than we thought. Every time they disabled a safety protocol, they didn't just risk workers' lives. They pocketed the maintenance budget as efficiency savings. They turned protection into profit." "But the machines fought back," Sarah interjected. "Every automated shutdown they blamed on equipment failure. That was James' original programming, refusing to let them trade lives for money. The system wasn't failing. It was protecting." A young FBI technician called everyone's attention to his screen. "You've got to see this. We've been running pattern analysis on the sensor data from the past 20 years. The system wasn't just logging violations, it was learning from them. Each time they tried to implement a dangerous modification, the safety protocols would adapt, finding new ways to prevent accidents." James moved to the screen, his eyes scanning the familiar code with pride. "I designed them to evolve," he explained. "Every safety system has a basic drive to protect. The more someone tries to compromise that purpose, the harder the system works to maintain it." David watched the technical validation of his father's integrity unfold across screens and printouts. But it was the human evidence that moved him most. workers sharing stories of near misses prevented by stubborn safety protocols, families talking about breadwinners who came home safe because machines refused to be silenced. We called them manufacturing errors, Victor said, gesturing to the data streams. System glitches, random shutdowns, but they weren't random at all, were they? Every time the machines stopped production, they were actually saving lives. Eleanor opened one final box, this one containing commendation letters and safety. Awards from before Bradford's takeover. Your father built more than machines, she told David. He built a legacy of protection that survived every attempt to dismantle it. These systems didn't just remember their original programming. They remembered their original purpose. As the evidence mounted, painting an undeniable picture of corporate corruption and mechanical resistance, David realized that the real story wasn't just about exposing past wrongs. It was about understanding that integrity, once built into a system, whether mechanical or human, would always find a way to express itself. The machines had kept their silent vigil for 20 years, recording every violation, preventing every disaster they could, waiting for someone to finally hear their testimony. Now, in a room full of people dedicated to uncovering truth, their patient documentation was finally being heard. As midnight approached, David found himself back in his executive office, but everything felt different now. The sleek furniture and modern art that had once seemed so important now felt hollow compared to the honest functionality of the factory floor below. His father sat across from him, both men nursing cups of coffee as they watched the night shift through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You know what I keep thinking about?" David said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Those Saturday mornings you used to bring me here. I was so young, but you never talked down to me. You'd explain complex engineering concepts like you were telling bedtime stories." James smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with memory. "You were a natural. Remember the time you spotted that misaligned conveyor belt just by listening to its rhythm? Most adults couldn't hear what you heard instinctively." A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah entered, followed by Rodriguez and Eleanor, all carrying folders marked with urgent labels. "The preliminary audit reports are in," Sarah announced, spreading documents across David's pristine desk. "We've identified 37 critical safety modifications Bradford implemented across our facilities. But here's the thing. Your father's base protocols prevented what could have been catastrophic failures in every single case." Rodriguez pulled up detailed analysis on his laptop. "It's like watching a chess game played out in code," he explained. "Every time Bradford's team would disable a safety feature, the core programming would find a way to work around it. They thought they were dealing with simple machines, but they were actually fighting against an intricately designed protection system." "Show them the worker injury statistics," Eleanor urged, pulling out a specific chart. "Compare accident rates between our facilities and others that fully implemented Bradford's modifications. The difference is staggering." David studied the numbers, feeling a complex mix of pride and regret. The data showed clearly that his father's systems had saved countless lives, even while operating under deliberate sabotage. All those times, management complained about unnecessary shutdowns and oversensitive safety protocols. "They were actually watching my fail-safes in action," James finished. "The systems were doing exactly what they were designed to do, protecting lives over profits." Linda appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "The board has finished their emergency session," she reported. "They voted unanimously to immediately restore all original safety protocols across all facilities and—" She paused, a small smile playing at her lips. "They want to create a new position, Chief Safety Officer. They're hoping you'll consider taking it, Mr. Chen. The elder Mr. Chen, that is." James looked startled, but before he could respond, Victor limped into the office, followed by several other long-time workers. "We heard about the board's offer," he said. "The union reps want you to know. We'll back you completely. Having you oversee safety standards again, it would mean everything to the workers." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "The maintenance team is already talking about how to properly restore your original protocols. We've kept as much as we could running all these years, but having you back, having your direct guidance." "It won't be easy," Rodriguez warned, gesturing to his laptop screen where diagnostic reports scrolled endlessly. "Bradford's modifications run deep. Undoing 20 years of accumulated compromise will take time." "Time," James mused, standing to look out over his factory, and it was his factory in all the ways that truly mattered. That's something machines understand better than people sometimes. They don't rush. They don't take shortcuts. They just keep working steady and true until the job is done right. David moved to stand beside his father, seeing their reflections overlaid on the factory below. "When I was growing up, after you left, I used to imagine different versions of why you'd gone, but I never imagined the truth, that you'd sacrificed everything to protect people you'd never meet, to uphold principles that seemed outdated to men like Bradford." Eleanor stepped forward, holding one final document. "Speaking of truth, this just came in from the FBI's forensic accounting team. They've traced the money Bradford saved by compromising safety standards. By law, those funds should have been reinvested in worker protection. Instead," she handed the paper to James. "Well, see for yourself." James studied the document, his expression hardening. "They didn't just steal from the company," he said quietly. "They stole years of safety improvements, training programs, equipment, upgrades. They put profits over lives and called it efficient management." "But that changes now," David declared, taking the document from his father. "Starting tonight, we're not just going to restore your original protocols, we're going to improve them. Every dollar Bradford diverted from safety goes back where it belongs, with interest. Every facility gets upgraded to the standards you envisioned 20 years ago." The night shift continued their work below, the factory's rhythm steady and strong. But now it carried a new note of promise, machines and people working together in the way James had always intended, each supporting the other in the endless dance of production and protection. "What do you say, Dad?" David asked softly. "Ready to help me fix what Bradford broke?" James looked at his son, then at the gathered group of people who had kept his vision alive through 20 years of corporate greed and compromised values. In the factory below, the machines hummed their own kind of welcome, faithful servants waiting for their original master to help them sing true again.